All right, it says we're live. Everybody, I hope we're live. I'm not 100% sure. My screen seems to be showing. Okay, there we go. All right. So, yeah, last week was the end of the Problematic campaign, and I had a great time talking to Serena Sketches. And we didn't talk so much about comics, but something interesting, in my opinion, happened is we just got to talk to people in the Comicsgate sphere, the kind of people that you hear on Twitter, just talking smack about this or that comic. And I was so fascinated by that conversation that I think that's something I would love to keep doing. So we actually have the honor, the privilege of having another guest similar. Dr. Lore, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Dr. Lore, and Serena Sketches is actually my wife in real life. So we met on an army trip in Korea back in 2005. So it's been a while, but yeah, it was something that they had called Better Opportunities for Single Soldiers, and she was based on one base in South Korea, and I was at another base, and the activity that they had was on yet another base, and so we met in Busan, South Korea, and hit it off, and things went from there.
Better opportunities in the sense that they're having military people meet each other in a romantic sense.
Well, I guess it's just what it is it's activities for single soldiers so they can get out and meet other singles.
Oh, okay.
And that's kind of what it is.
It's kind of cool. I didn't know they did that.
Oh yeah.
So
it's done through I think it's like connected with what they call MWR, which is morale, welfare, and recreation.
Okay. Would it have been were you guys stationed there, or was it kind of hang out in Korea?
Yes, we were both stationed there at the time, both active duty military.
All right. So last week we interviewed Serena Sketches. If you guys missed it, you can just go back and listen to that. I thought it was a very interesting conversation. We got to talk about all kinds of things like travel and military life. And I just thought it would be fascinating to hear. I mean, she recommended I talk to you, of course. And so there are a couple of topics that popped up that I said, oh, wow, that kind of stuff fascinates me too. Like when I was a little kid, I used to read all kinds of like military books and all that kind of thing. And I just thought the lifestyle was so admirable. I was never brave enough or anything like that to try it out myself. But I admire it so much. And I think it's such a pleasure to talk to people who have experienced it. I mean, not to sound patronizing in any way, I promise. I just think it's really fascinating. So I'm just anything that you're interested in talking about, I'd love to hear about how you got or how you ended up following that career path, so that sort of thing, if you're interested.
Well, for me, I wasn't really thinking about the military until probably my last semester of college. I went to a school called Tennessee Temple University in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and squeezed 4 years into 5 to get my degree. But the last semester of college, I had finished up almost all of my work. I had like 1 or 2 classes left, and I was doing those through correspondence. But I took the opportunity of doing an internship in the U.S. Senate at the time. So during my last semester of college, I was actually in D.C. area working in the Senate with the Senate Finance Committee, specifically with the investigations and oversight staff. So I was right there smack dab in the middle of the Enron hearings.
Okay. Which years were that? I forget.
This was 2002.
Okay. And I know we got some younger people, can you refresh everyone on what the Enron thing was about?
Well, I mean, it was big.
If you want.
Well, it was a big energy company out of Houston, and there was a lot of like cooking the books, I guess. They were hiding some of the financial losses they had to make their stocks look healthier than they were.
Okay.
So there was a lot. There's some corruption going on there, and even being there during the hearings, I don't know all the details of exactly what happened, but that was basically the gist of it.
Okay, so you were there investigating with them, and
Well,
then
what I was just working in the
uh,
committee, but what they were doing was they were investigating not just the finance committee, but Congress in general was investigating Enron,
mhm.
and they were bringing in Enron executives for testimonies and stuff. And I don't remember why it got to the level of a congressional investigation exactly,
Hmm.
but it did. And so mainly what they had me doing was compiling things, just doing a bunch of like, office stuff to free up the regular staffers to do the more important things. And occasionally, if there was a hearing that, because there was a lot of hearings going on for different committees and stuff, and so if they didn't have a staffer available to go to one of them, sometimes they would send me and have me take notes
Mhm.
as to kind of what went down in that particular hearing. And it was kind of interesting. I got a chance to see some congressmen and senators up close. And I remember in one of the hearings, I had arrived a little early because I was always the type to arrive early where I went.
Mhm.
And there was somebody who arrived a little bit after me and came and sat down right behind me. And I turned to see who it was, and it was the Reverend Jesse Jackson sitting right behind me.
Huh.
So that was kind of interesting. And then it was a small hearing room. There wasn't very many people in there, like
Mhm.
maybe 20, 30 people in the whole room, and including like 5 senators, I think 4 or 5 senators, and one of whom was Joseph Lieberman.
How about that?
So that was kind of
Small
interesting.
world then.
Well, I actually ended up having a chance encounter with Senator Lieberman later. Had a conversation with him. That was interesting because as an intern, we weren't supposed to go up and strike up conversations with senators. You don't do that.
Uh,
Um, you're lowest on the totem pole there.
sure.
But if they speak to you first, then of course you can respond. So there was one point I was on. They have like this little private metro, I guess, like a miniature subway that connects some of the Senate office buildings with the basement of the Capitol building. And since I was working there, I was able to use this. Um, and I had to go over to the Capitol building for some reason, and I just gotten on, and someone got on behind me. I turn around, there's Senator Lieberman right there, and he says, "Hey, how's it going?" and strikes up a conversation with me. So
Hmm.
that was kind of interesting.
And this was fresh out of college.
Well, I was still in college technically. This was
Oh,
during my last semester of college,
okay.
and I was actually getting some college credit for doing this too.
All right. So you graduated soon after.
Yes, well, it was right as I was finishing up there. I was actually trying to get a job as a regular staffer, and it just wasn't materializing very quickly. And I did have one job where they'd said maybe, but they wouldn't be able to give me an answer on whether or not I had the job until like July, I think.
Mhm.
And I was going to be graduating the beginning of May. And so I'm like, well, I don't have any money. My money's pretty much run out by the end of the semester, and
Yeah.
so I was like, I didn't have money to pay for a place to stay or any of that. I didn't have a job, so I was like, I need to do something. I'm going to have to start paying back my student loans. So that's when probably about a month before my internship ended, that's when I started looking into the military. And
Okay.
it wasn't really but I didn't actually go in and talk to a recruiter though until the day I graduated. It was, in fact, I graduated, got my diploma, and then I immediately went to talk to the recruiter right after that. Like, within 20 minutes of leaving the campus, I was talking to a recruiter.
Mhm.
Went to Air Force recruiter first, actually, but they had told me because I asked them. I said, "Well, I've got a college degree. What about coming in as an officer? How long would that take me before I could actually leave for training, start making money?" And they said, "Well, we're looking a year and a half."
Mhm.
Like, really? Wow. So what if I went enlisted? They said, well, 7 months. And I was like, oh, it's still not good. So I went next door to the Army recruiter and asked him if I came in as an officer, how long it would take. And he said, well, probably close to a year. And I was like, well, what if I went enlisted? How soon could I leave for basic? He said 3 weeks. So I was like, okay. So I did. I went enlisted, and because I went enlisted, I was able to qualify for the Army's student loan repayment program. So they paid back my student loans for me.
Okay. So it was at the time it was a financial decision.
Yes, it was
Okay.
primarily.
And with these years, you don't have to be specific if you don't want. Was this close to or at the very beginning of Afghanistan?
Well, yes, Afghanistan had started just a few months before this. We hadn't gone into Iraq yet, but I
Okay.
mean, this was probably I mean, 9/11. That was September of 2001, right?
Mhm.
And I joined in May of 2002, so it was just a few months after 9/11.
Okay. So you basically knew what, or you assumed this is, it's pretty clear what you're going to be getting into.
Yeah, yeah. Although the field that I went into, I wasn't going in as infantry.
I see. I
So
see.
I was like, well, I knew I wasn't going to be the kind of soldier that was going to be going out kicking down doors and stuff necessarily.
Sure.
But I mean, when you're going into a combat zone, there's always danger involved.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So you enlisted, you went through basic and all that stuff. I'm sure everybody goes through basic, right?
Yeah.
Because I only know what I've read, but
Yes, and it wasn't quite as badass as I thought it was going to be. It was,
no.
I mean, well, when I was joining, I'd always pictured, with basic training, the way I pictured it was probably more like what Ranger school's like, because I thought I was going to be out, uh, dropped off in the wilderness and forced to make my way through the woods alone, and all that kind of stuff, which apparently you do that stuff in Ranger school, although I never went to Ranger school, but
Mhm.
but no, it was mostly just a lot of PT, physical training, and a lot of marching, and it's just your basic stuff, basic
Okay.
rifle marksmanship, things of that sort. Very, very intensely physical, but not a lot of like, not like no jumping out of planes or anything like that.
Okay. Yeah, because the extreme stuff or the stories you hear about people like quitting, those are the really tough ones. Not to say that the general soldier is not tough. It's like the
Mhm.
SEAL stories you hear, they actually try to kick people out or get them to
Yeah.
quit.
Well, basic training. I mean, especially Army basic training. Compared to I mean, I imagine Air Force basic training is tough, but the Army is a lot tougher as far as that
Yeah.
goes. And from what I hear, the Marine Corps may be even tougher. Although I can't speak to that. I didn't haven't been through it.
Mm.
Um, but even within the Army, I think a lot of it depends on which basic training base you go to, because there's several different places you can go for basic training. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize each base had different programs.
Well, it's not so much that the programs are different. It's just a lot of it has to do with the environment and just the way that they tailor it for different MOSs, because different MOSs or military occupational specialties
Mm.
they'll tend to send to different basic training places. So, like for instance, infantry, most infantry goes through at Fort Benning, Georgia, and
Okay.
so because they're infantry, the drill sergeants are going to be really tough, right?
Mm.
Whereas if you got a basic training company where the vast majority of them are going to be truck drivers, the drill sergeants might not necessarily be. I mean, they're still going to be tough, but they might not necessarily be pushing them quite as hard,
I see.
I guess. I mean, and I don't know if that's. I don't know if that's like. I don't think that's policy to go easy on people, that are not infantry.
Mhm.
But I mean, if you know that the trainees you're training, if as a drill instructor, if you know that the trainees you're training are not going to be combat arms but support,
Yeah.
then I mean, I imagine subconsciously that would affect how you do the training.
Sure. You wouldn't want to scare them off.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess.
No, I'm kidding around. It's probably not appropriate, but I've always imagined that as enthusiastic as I might have been after 9/11, let's say as a young person, I think I was 15.
Hmm.
Um, I'm a very sensitive person, so I can admire it from the outside, but I don't think I would do very well.
Well, I was not the type of guy that you would have thought to be a soldier before I went
Uh-huh.
to training. I was the really scrawny, skinny type,
Mhm.
very much the nerd. And there was a friend of mine that when he heard I was going to join the army, go to basic training, he's like, "Oh no, you're not going to make it through basic training."
So
And I
you
was,
were braced for the worst.
and I was like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Well, you know so and so." I was like, "Yeah." He's like, he tried going through basic training, he made it halfway, and he washed out. And I'm
Jeez.
like, I'm like, well, that's him, you know.
Mm.
He's like, well, he's tougher than you. I'm like, we'll see that. So yeah, so that
Huh.
was kind of a motivator for me because I was like, okay, I'm gonna call this guy up the day I graduate from basic training and let him know, hey, I finished.
Huh.
And so, and I did. I called him the day that I finished, the day after I walked across the stage, and you know, I called him up and I said, hey, finished basic training. I'm going on my next duty station.
Mm. Give him the old "I told you so."
Pretty much, yeah.
Well, that's good. So you were very proud of that.
Oh
And
yeah.
where did they send you, if I could ask?
I went to language school after that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, without asking too much, then. So generally, the reason I'm asking about military stuff, as interested as I am, I just love the stories. Like I think I mentioned last week, I listened to like Jocko Willink's podcast, if you've heard of it.
Not sure about that one.
He's I don't remember his rank. I'm going to butcher it, but he was in the SEALs, and he talks about stories of his time. I think it was Iraq, and but also he interviews all kinds of military people, like talks about history, and even going so far back as talking about World War II vet stories, like having old vets come on and from Vietnam, for instance, telling stories about that.
Yeah.
All kinds of like different war stories, and but especially I like the image that we get of the human mind, of what happens when they're put in these kinds of situations. I've always found that fascinating. But the reason I ask that and the reason I bring these up is because I think a lot of the Comicsgate types of people, or I feel like there's a lot of military background, maybe with the Comicsgate people, but maybe that's just because I'm fairly new to the crowd. It seems maybe that's a background, and I'm curious if do you have any thoughts why, or maybe I'm reading it wrong.
Repeat the question again because I'm not sure if I completely understood.
So sorry. It's
No.
late for me. Yeah, I feel like a lot of Comicsgate people are or were or know someone who was in the military, and I think that's an interesting pattern.
Well, I could definitely see that.
Mm.
And not this is not to say that Comicsgate tends to be more conservative and less liberal,
Uh,
but if you look at the military, that tends to be the case,
is that
right?
so?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at on average, I'd say probably 75% of the military tends to be more on the right.
Interesting. I
Now,
guess that makes sense.
that's not true across the board. I mean, there are plenty of soldiers who are not, but
Mm.
you know, I think it also varies depending on the service too. So, like for instance, it's probably not quite as high in the Air Force as it is in the Army and the Marines. You know,
I see.
the Marines are probably highest. I would imagine.
Hmm. So there's just a parallel in terms of.
Speaking of Marines,
Mhm.
after I got out of the Army for a while and was working as a military contractor, I actually ended up working with the Marines in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
And almost every Marine I spoke to, when I asked them where they were from, I usually got one of two answers. It was either I'm from Texas or I'm from fill in the blank, but I'm planning to move to Texas once I'm out. So most Marines I met wanted to be Texans. I thought that was interesting.
Are you comfortable saying where you're from?
I'm from Texas, actually. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So there seems to be, I've always admired Texas as a state. If anyone doesn't know, I'm from New Jersey. So I'm watching the rest of the country from a very specific, I've always lived here.
Mhm.
So everyone knows what New Jersey is, politically and demographically and all that stuff. But you hear about the stories of Texas, and it's like its own country within the country. I think it's fascinating.
Right. Well,
They,
one of my novels, it stays its own country because I've got a novel I've been working on for a while where it's one of those alternate history ones,
uh-huh.
and the premise is where someone goes back in time and gives modern weapons to the defenders of the Alamo. So you got Davy Crockett with an AR-15 or something, you know. And in that alternate reality, Texas remains its own country, going forward, although it becomes allied with the U.S.
Okay. And for anyone who doesn't know, you're just a writer, or do you do art as well?
Oh, I'm my art would be terrible.
Mhm.
I've I've tried to do art, but no, I'm not an artist by any stretch of the imagination.
Are you planning to do a book for Comicsgate or
It's
anything?
not when it comes to visual arts. I'm sorry. Say that again.
I'm sorry. Are we? Uh, I think I failed to ask last week, Serena. But are you writing a book for Comicsgate or just novels?
Yes, actually, I wrote a novel, yeah, post-apocalyptic novel actually.
Okay.
That I went back and I've been converting that into comic book scripts,
Hmm.
and Serena and I are putting that out as a graphic novel.
Well, that's good. And it's not out yet, right?
No, it's not. Although,
Okay.
if you would like, I can probably share some images with you. If you give me a minute to pull them up, I can screen share those. Okay.
Sure. In the meantime, I'll take a look at the comments here.
Okay.
Not too many comments, but I'm always amazed. I want to thank everybody who's here. It's such an honor that anyone would want to spend time with me on a Sunday night when you guys could be listening to anything else. So I'm amazed and I'm so very humbled. Let's see. Shade, you agree with me. Jocko is one badass MFer. Yes, he is. If any of you don't know and you're interested in military history or just examining human nature under really intense circumstances, you got to look up Jocko Willink. He does an amazing podcast. And I don't even know where I would start you, but man, he's got some good ones. If you look up a list of his best ones, you'll encounter some really like I could recommend some, but they're kind of on the dark side. But they're so good. Um,
Okay, let's see here. I can go ahead, see if I can figure out how to screen share here.
sure.
There it is. Okay.
All right, I'll
All right.
highlight you so they could see.
All right. Can you see?
Yep.
Okay. So Phoenix Ashes is, as you can see, it's about a group of young people that are trying to survive in a world that's been devastated by nuclear war. It's set in rural East Texas, primarily in Rusk County.
Mhm.
Um, and let's see here. This is some of the main characters.
Mhm.
There's an image showing some of the main characters, the character designs that Serena has done. So going from a right to left, we've got Madison, um, and then Rob,
Mhm.
Ricky, and Cassandra. Now Madison and Ricky, they are brother and sister. They grew up most of their growing up. They lived in Germany because
Mhm.
their dad was military and then later worked as a contractor there. And their mother is actually German. All right. Um, Rob lived in Germany when they were kids, and he knew them then. But he's lived in Texas for more than he's lived in Germany.
Mhm.
And then Cassandra is a friend of Madison's who just transferred into the school at the beginning of the school year. She's kind of an artist and a rebel, and she's originally from Alabama, but her family moved to East Texas. Then we've got the Marquis. He's kind of he's probably the top villain in the story, right?
Mhm.
And he's originally a congressman from up north, Massachusetts to be specific. But he was in New Orleans at the time that the nuclear war happened, and he ends up meeting this guy who fancies himself to be descended from the French royalty, right? And
So
so he
okay.
kind of takes the opportunity to proclaim himself to be King Louis the 19th, right? Now he doesn't really have a chance of making it, and taking over anything by himself. He's just basically a rabble rouser. But this guy, this congressman, basically, he sees it as an opportunity to gain power for himself, and so he helps manipulate and help this guy take over as king of the kingdom of Greater Louisiana,
Mhm.
right? With himself as kind of the power behind the throne, and he takes the title Marquis de Lafayette.
Hmm.
All right, because this guy, though, the king, he he wants all his soldiers to wear these uniforms that are inspired by the old days, I guess you could say. Which is why you see the Marquis wearing the wig and everything. Although if you look closely, he's got modern boots and modern firearm and all that.
There you go. Sand Slasher, that answers your question. The get up, he says.
Yep.
Shade asks, ask your guest what religions are around in this post-apocalyptic world. Most post-apocs don't touch on that. Is that something that you're planning to write about?
Well, I don't really get into that a whole lot. I do mention that they go to a Baptist church at the beginning of the story. Although I don't recall if I've actually mentioned that in the graphic novel version or not. I know in the novel it's mentioned, but there's a lot of dialogue I had to cut for the graphic novel too.
Yeah, that's always a downside, isn't it? I can't remember what the conversion is, but I think for me, a comic page is about 4 written pages, 3 or 4 written pages for one comic page. Or no, the other way around. The other way around.
Sometimes I think the way it worked out with me is probably about every 50 pages of the novel ended up being one issue, and one issue being about 28 to 30 pages.
Okay. But a lot of content, you feel like you had to distill it.
Yes, I did. And even still, I probably have a little bit more dialogue. This one's probably going to be a little bit more dialogue heavy than your average comic book that's written from the ground up as a comic book, I would add.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
It's being planned as an issue-by-issue American-style comic?
Well, we're not really sure yet exactly how we're going to do it. Where we may release it by issues first, and then eventually, and then once they're all out, do a full graphic novel version. Haven't decided that yet, but it's looking like it's going to be 7 issues all total. You can put them into graphic novel form.
And if anyone's coming in late, the artist is Serena Sketches on Twitter.
And now, by the way, she's the artist here for the character designs, but that logo that you see there, we actually got Bob Stone to do that.
Bob Stone.
He's the guy that did the logo for, if I remember correctly, I think it was for Jawbreakers.
Okay.
I think I'd have to check on that one. Serena would know. But no, he actually after he did the logo for us. And by the way, he did logos for the 2 sequels to Phoenix Ashes as well, because we have the ones coming after that is Phoenix Rebirth and Phoenix Rising. Right? Those novels aren't completely written yet, though.
I see.
Okay, those are planned. But anyway, we shared some of the story with him though, and he liked my writing, and so he asked me to work with him on another graphic novel. So he and I are actually working on a second graphic novel series called Pendulum.
Okay.
And that one's kind of more of a how shall I describe that one? Give me a second here. I can show you a little bit of that if I've saved it here. Give me a minute. Pendulum.
Let's see. I'll take a look at the comments again.
Oh, here we are.
Oh, you got it?
Okay. I'm not sure if I actually have them saved here. I might have to show them another time, but I only have a couple sketches so far for that one. But basically, that one's kind of secret agents. Think like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. sort of, but with cybernetic implants, and different universe, of course. It's not connected to that at all. But that kind of genre, I guess.
Okay.
On top of that, by the way, with Phoenix Ashes, we've actually got Kyle Ritter is going to be doing the coloring for the cover of the first issue.
Very nice. Now, Kyle, in case anyone doesn't know, Kyle Ritter is the colorist for Cyberfrog and many other projects. He's been doing a lot of commission work lately. But I'm sure anyone who's here knows who Kyle Ritter is. I just wanted to make sure.
I also have a short story named Darkness that I've converted into a comic book script as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a one shot though, 28 pages.
Yeah.
And it's nothing's nailed down yet, but I'm in talks with mine's drawing a blank now. Matthew Weldon.
Mm-hmm. I'm not familiar with that one.
Matthew Weldon to do the art on that one. He's done some combo books through Image Comics.
Okay.
Right, and he's a kind of up and coming artist within the comic book industry right now. He's really good. Hmm. He's been on Drawn and Quartered a few times and the Friday Night Auction. I don't know if you guys ever watched those.
I have heard of them. I've been jealous.
Well,
I wish.
Let me see if I can pull up. Give me a minute here. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can go to his page, show you what some of his stuff looks like.
Okay.
Okay. So let's see here. Yeah, Punchline is the one that he's most known for, I think. But he's done a bunch of other stuff too. See, here's that's one of his that's some art that he did there of Thanos. He's really good.
That's great.
But like I said, you know, he's expressed interest in doing it. He's just not sure. It might be a while, you know, before he can do that. So if he does do it, it's probably going to be not until late next year, maybe.
Okay. Now, a lot of people in Comicsgate are sort of crossing paths. What are some of the projects that you've been interested in so far? If you're following it at all, I'm not sure.
As far as
like, gosh, I can't remember the names of them right now. There's one that's about a fishing boat where they encounter all these Cthulhu-like monsters, and I can't remember the name of it, but I've been so fascinated by some of, like, the quality of the recent books is really stunning. Are there any books or projects that you've been keeping an eye on lately?
Well, let me think here. I'm trying to think here. I mean, mainly this is the main ones, and tell you the truth, I've never been as big of a comic book reader as my wife is.
Oh, okay.
She's the one who's more into comics than I have been. So I've always been more of a reader of novels. Mm-hmm. Although I have enjoyed comic books here and there. That's not something that that I've read consistently, I guess you could say.
I see.
I read a lot of comic books back when I was in college, and that was kind of when the Death of Superman thing was going on, and mm-hmm. Or had just recently happened anyway. And then there was one called Kingdom Come. That was actually Mark Waid, I believe it was, that did that one back before he went off the deep end.
Yeah.
And I actually enjoyed that one. But after I got in the Army, and for a long time I wasn't really following comics a lot. Yeah. And it's only been recently that I've kind of started getting back into it. But I've read a few comics recently that I really enjoyed. I read the Trump Space Force one, that was really good, and then Iron Sights, a couple of Doug TenNaples books, including Ghostopolis. Although I haven't finished that one yet, I need to go back and finish reading that one. And yeah,
Shade mentions Bigfoot Bill.
Yeah, well, we don't have that one yet. I don't have that one yet.
Yeah,
I think he's just getting ready to send those out, right?
I don't remember what exactly or what percentage wise he's finished, but
yeah, I know he's been posting some stuff about the printers, showing the print of it. So
that means it's very close then.
So yeah, that's the latest I heard. But no, I'm actually reading Lone Star right now. I haven't got very far yet in it because I've been kind of busy. But
yeah,
I need to go back and finish that one too. I keep so busy with some of my own projects though that I fall behind on the other things I want to watch or read or whatever.
I have the same problem. I barely even have the energy to read. Most of the time I have so many projects that I'm trying to juggle and failing to juggle. But there's so many books that I just buy them and they sit there forever. And
Well, on top of doing the comic book stuff, some of the other projects I've got, I'm trying to build a YouTube channel, so I've got a couple of, I'm starting to release videos on historical topics,
mhm.
and I've got other videos. I just started doing a series. I'm just starting to do a series now on movie reviews. I just did my first movie review. I'm putting together the video as we speak this evening. Well, actually, I'm not doing it right now, obviously, because we're doing this.
Right.
uh, but then I have another series that I'm starting as well, where I'm going to be getting into the etymology of names. Where
Okay.
I'm going to be taking like the first video I've got, which I've already done the sound recording for. I just haven't finished putting it together. Is I took the top 10 most common names in the United States, surnames that is,
Mhm.
and I get into the etymology of where the name comes from.
Mhm.
Not just where it comes from within English, but tracing back all the roots of the various parts of the name, all the way back to Proto-Indo-European and stuff.
My goodness. So you're a huge history buff, I've heard.
Oh yeah. Well,
Okay.
I ended up picking up a master's in it while I was on active duty the first time around.
All right. So not only with language, I assume it's language as it relates to history, but
Yeah, well, I enjoy. That's one aspect of just studying history that I really like too, is getting into the etymology of things
yeah.
and finding out where the words came from and where names come from and so on. You know,
Mhm.
so
What are some of the historical topics that interest you for your channel? And also, what's the name of your channel so we can
oh, okay.
follow
Well,
it?
on YouTube, I'm Dr. Lore.
Mhm.
So that's DoctorLore. I don't have like a really big channel yet. So far, I only got 45 subscribers, so it's just not very big yet. But
Mhm.
probably the easiest way to find me is to type in "The Quest for the Philosopher's Stone." That's one of the videos I did, and if you do that, then you'll be able to see a video done by Dr. Lore, which is me, and let's see here. In fact, let me go ahead and do that real quick
Sure.
for the Philosopher's Stone. I'm sure there'll probably be a couple of other videos that will come up
Mhm.
besides mine, but I'm doing that right now, and it looks like mine's the top one. Okay, so you'll see the image that you see for me right now, my little icon or whatever. You'll see that in the top result. Okay, so
There you
it'll
go.
say the Quest for the Philosopher's Stone, and then below that is Dr. Lore. Um, so, but yeah, no, I've that's my channel.
And what are some of the common themes that sort of ignites your curiosity about history?
Well, the series I'm doing on history on there right now is it's called Hidden Archives.
Mhm.
Okay, and I actually have a blog called Hidden Archives, which you can link to from my Twitter.
Okay.
Okay. Uh,
Which is also Dr. Lore.
yes, well, actually on Twitter, Dr. Lore was already taken from somebody else, so I'm at Lore Doctor on
Oh,
that one.
all right.
I mean, I go by Dr. Lore, but as far as it's at Lore Doctor.
Gotcha.
So just put it the other way around. Um, but yes, no. The historical videos I do, I try to take topics that are not things that people have heard about in history class, things that are like a bit out there. So, for instance, like one of my videos is the quest for the Philosopher's Stone, where I dig into medieval alchemy and where it came from and what it actually was,
Okay.
right? Which is not something that you would normally hear about if you're just taking a regular history class, right?
It goes into sort of hearsay and rumors as opposed to.
Well, no, not so much that. In fact, this video is based on an actual research paper I did where I
Oh, okay.
cited sources and all that kind of stuff. Now, I don't cite all the sources in the video. Obviously, there's not time for that. But no, just topics that are not something that you would hear about in your average everyday history class,
Okay.
right? And so, like, for instance, another of the videos has to do with the Elizabethan spy network of Francis Walsingham during Elizabethan England and how they were instrumental in thwarting the invasion of the Spanish Armada, among other things.
Refresh me. What year was that?
The Spanish Armada was 1588.
Okay.
But I get into kind of the years leading up to that and how they were keeping intelligence on the movement of the Spanish fleets, and how Francis Walsingham actually built up a spy network that was light years beyond what everybody else had at the time.
Mhm.
At the time, most espionage or intelligence gathering was done by just going out and talking to merchants who had traveled in other countries and asking, "Hey, what hearsay did you have?" So it was, a lot of the intelligence was based on hearsay back then.
Mhm.
And that's not to say that there probably isn't a place for that now. I couldn't say, but what Walsingham did was he refined it, and he kind of laid the groundwork for what was to come later. In fact, MI6 now in Britain, I mean, they can trace it all the way back to him, basically.
Okay.
And speaking of MI6, by the way, one of the agents who worked for Queen Elizabeth at the time, probably through Walsingham, although it's not absolutely clear, but was a guy by the name of Dr. John Dee.
Mhm.
Okay, and Dr. John Dee, he was the head of the Rosicrucian Order, which was like a secret society in England at the time, and uh, he was also a close associate of Francis Bacon. Right.
Mhm.
Well, Dee was also the Queen's astrologer, right? And he was like into astrology and numerology and all that kind of weird stuff. But because he was an astrologer, his services were sought by various other courts in Europe, and so he would actually travel around Europe to do astrological readings for people and stuff. But he would use that as a cover to gather intelligence as well, and
Mhm.
then he would send back secret coded correspondence to the Queen to let her know about some of the intelligence that he'd gathered, right?
Mhm.
But when he wouldn't sign his name to the letters that he was sending back. He was instead use a code word or code name,
Mhm.
and the code name that he signed with was 007.
Oh,
He was the original 007. Yes,
that's cool.
the real 007, I guess you could say. In fact, when Ian Fleming invented his James Bond character, D was kind of his inspiration for that. And
Hmm.
in fact, he'd originally intended to bring in some of the alchemical stuff, and have James Bond be, into some of that, but it didn't end up developing that way.
That would have been an interesting turn for the series.
It would have, yeah.
So is it just let's say how politics relates to I'm trying to find the common themes of the things that fascinate you in history. Is it the sort of interpersonal secret keeping and trying to probe for secrets
Well,
and
my interests have shifted a lot over the years.
mm,
When I was really young, I was all about just the straight up military history and learning about all the military leaders and the battles and all that kind of stuff.
mm,
Um, and then as I got to working on my bachelor's degree years ago, toward the end of it, I started getting more and more interested in the economics and how money and power drive everything.
mm.
And so that for all throughout the time I was working on my master's degree, that was like a large part of my focus too. Um, Now, since completing my master's degree in the past few years, and as I've started writing novels and other stories, particularly ones with a historical setting, I found myself more and more fascinated with learning about the cultural norms of each society that I'm looking at.
Uh-huh.
You know? And so cultural history has become a big fascinating point for me.
What are some of the most interesting cultures that you've studied?
Oh,
I know that's a very general question. Let's say day-to-day life, uh, bizarre things they believed,
well,
rituals.
one thing I found really interesting is just studying our own culture in history.
Mhm.
So like you look at America, and we're a lot more culturally monolithic now than we used to be. I mean, not completely, obviously. I mean, New York is going to be quite a bit different from Texas, and Texas is going to be a lot different from California, and so on.
Yeah.
But the differences now are not as extreme as they once were from one part of the country to the other, as far as the cultural norms, I guess you could say, the mores and so on. Right.
Would you say because communication's easier now?
Probably. Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. That and mass communication, Hollywood, all that.
Yeah.
The entertainments and so on. But you go back in time to say the 1800s and stuff, and the culture of the Scots-Irish living in the Appalachians was a lot different from the people on the plantations in the Deep South.
I see.
Even though they were both part of the quote unquote the South, there was really two very distinct cultures in the South. Actually, three, if you really want to be technical, because the Tidewater culture of like Virginia and parts of North Carolina was different from the further down Deep South.
Mm-hmm. And this was as it was being settled.
Right. And of course, over time, the Virginia Tidewater culture came to be more and more closely associated with that of the Deep South, like South Carolina and further down, Mississippi, Alabama, and so on. But even within those states too, if you looked at the coastal regions where all the plantations were, and you had the plantation owners who were really wealthy and so on, and then you go inland, it's primarily Scots-Irish, right? Whereas the plantation owners in the Deep South, they were primarily families that traced their ancestry back to the Normans of England. Not even the Anglo-Saxons of England, but the Norman conquerors of England. And a lot of those plantation owners too looked down on anyone who would not just on anyone who was not white, but anyone who was not Norman specifically.
Yeah, I suppose in any culture you'll find people saying that our people are the best and everybody else, is beneath us.
Mm-hmm.
Or at the very least, you have these microcultures brewing as the new frontier is being settled. Let's say everyone has their little pocket of people that they know, their families, trusted families. They wouldn't be very trusting of outsiders. You don't get a lot of the Wild West stranger coming into town and fixing things. Usually they would just get killed. I imagine.
Another thing you often don't hear about the Deep South too, and in general, is the slavery of Irish people. That's something that's almost never talked about in history. Because now a lot of times, if they do acknowledge it, they assume that, oh well, those were just indentured servants. That's not actually the case. Okay. If you go back to the 1600s, now of course over time it becomes less and less. But back in the 1600s, when the English pretty much took over all of Ireland, they already controlled parts of Ireland before that. They controlled an area around Dublin called the Pale, right? And the English looked down on the Irish and considered them barbarians. And so anything that was not within that region that they controlled, which was called the Pale, that was beyond the Pale. That's where that phrase comes from,
right?
Meaning barbarian, right? Kind of a very horrible term if you think about it closely. But whenever Cromwell, when he was Lord Protector of England, he was the one that went in and finished the takeover of Ireland, right? And before that happened in 1642, I believe it was, the population of Ireland was about 1.5 million. Some estimates are maybe about 1.6 million, right? Well, within about less than 15 years, by the middle of the 1650s, that population had dropped to about 1 million or 1.1 million. So they'd killed about 500,000 Irish, either directly or as a result of the famines, because they were burning all the crops, causing famine across the Isle of Ireland. And then of the remaining population, many of them were then taken and sold into slavery. Right.
And that's how they would have come to America, as slaves.
A lot of Irish did. Not all of them, because there's you got the Scots-Irish are a different group entirely, and I'll get to that in just a second here. But a lot of the Irish, though, that were taken to America were taken as slaves, and I'm not talking indentured servants. They were chattel slaves. They would literally strip them naked, put them up on the block, and sell them. Right. And initially, a lot of them were going to Barbados, not to what we would now call the United States. Although later on, many of them did end up in the U.S. and they started coming into Virginia. In fact, in the year 1700, I believe it was, the governor of Virginia owned 8,000 slaves. 2,000 were African slaves, but 6,000 were Irish. And that's something you often don't hear about. Now, over time, you don't. Over time, the numbers began to decrease, or at least the numbers that we know about. But a lot of that had to do with the fact that a lot of the Irish slaves were intermarrying with the African slaves, and so their descendants, or whatever, their descendants, were not seen as being Irish anymore at that point, at least not by the slave owners.
Wow. Yeah, that's news to me. I didn't.
Yeah, well,
I
most
didn't
people,
know it was that many.
a lot of people don't realize it. Now, we don't know exactly the full numbers of how many Irish were sold into slavery. Some of the more conservative estimates say it was 50,000 or so, but some estimates say it was as many as 500,000, which would have been like a third of the population, or half of the remaining population after the English killed a lot of them. Now, I don't know that it was quite that high, but I'm inclined to believe that it was a lot more than 50,000, maybe a 250,000, maybe 500,000. I can't say for sure. We don't really know. But one reason why you often don't hear about it too, though, is, like I said, because for one thing, a lot of these Irish slaves were intermarrying with the African slaves that were being brought over, and kind of disappearing into that, because there were a lot more African slaves than there were of Irish. There were over the 150 years of the slave trade, or more. I know there was 13 million, I think, that were brought over from Africa. Yeah, whereas compared to 250,000, maybe 500,000 of Irish. But
My goodness.
But yeah, that's not something that that's often talked about. That's like one of those like hidden things in history that it just doesn't often make it into the history books. At least not your average textbook anyway. We'll talk about that.
Wow, that would be an interesting book. I wonder if there's movies and that sort of thing. That
but there are a few books out there. One of them which I've read is called "To Hell or Barbados." In fact, Barbados was actually kind of the crux, I guess you could say, of the whole Deep South culture, because Barbados was settled very early in the 1600s by the British. And that's kind of where that whole slave culture got its start. And then they exported it because they began to, the Barbadians began to outgrow the island. And so they actually, they went and settled in South Carolina. In fact, South Carolina was not settled from England, but from Barbados. So it was kind of almost a colony of a colony in a way. And then they spread out from there across what's now Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi, and across there. So the whole Deep South culture, really had its origins in Barbados.
Oh, and that's very far away in some ways. They would have migrated, I suppose, across Dominican Republic, those countries. So I don't hear I don't hear stories about Irish people ending up in those islands, but they would have vacated them by recent times, I'm sure.
Well, not necessarily, because like I said, a lot of them ended up intermarrying.
I see. So for all we know.
So a lot of the people that live there now could have some Irish ancestors.
Oh.
Although right at this point, it's mostly mixed.
Sure. Wow, that's that'd be quite a thing to study. I didn't even know about any of that, but I want to look this stuff up now. Are there any resources that you would recommend?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there. It's just well, that one book I mentioned was a good resource, but there are others out there as well. Some of them are better written than others, though.
Sure, I'll have to ask my Irish pals about that.
But no, I do remember coming across, and I don't remember where I saw it. Somewhere online, I came across an old excerpt from a newspaper from 1845, though, which tells us that even 15 years before the war between the states took place, there were full-fledged Irish slaves in the Deep South, because Frederick Law Olmsted, he talked about seeing a group of Irish slaves loading cotton into a ship in Mobile, Alabama.
Wow.
Yeah.
If nothing else, now we're painting the lore doctor, Dr. Lore here, as an expert, as far as I'm concerned, in very deep and interesting history that you would not have heard anywhere else, probably. I just want I got to make it clear for everybody. You got to sub to his channel, and how many videos do you have on your channel about this kind of thing? And
well, so far I've just got a couple out. I've got a
okay,
third one I'm in the process of making right now, and I've got a few other articles written that I'm planning to convert into videos as well.
that's a great idea.
If you go on my blog, you'll see several articles on there. But
And how do we find that?
let's see. Okay, so if you go to @LoreDoctor on my Twitter,
Yep.
so you go to my profile, then on the left-hand side you'll see a link to my blog, which is called Hidden Archives.
Mhm.
So you'll see it'll say galadrin.wixsite.com/hidden archives.
Okay. And for anyone listening now, this is going to be a writer that's going to be working with the Comicscape people. And I don't mean to bring it down. Unfortunately, I don't have a ton of time left, but I do want to keep picking your brain just a little more and find any sort of topics that might tantalize the readers and sort of get them to know you better and what kind of things you're passionate about. Is there any subjects, military, history? What kind of things are you passionate about that the future of your channel and also your writing? What sort of things would you want people to know you for and follow you for?
Well, I do have a few other things out there. You know, I've got in addition to my own writings, I like to put out my own editions of things too. Like I published an edition of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer that's available on Amazon. That where I took the text and I put footnotes at the bottom.
Uh-huh.
So I have like a total of like 90 footnotes or reference notes explaining things in the text that people that modern readers might not necessarily understand about the story. So, like for instance, in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, when Tom is talking to another boy and he says, white alley," and it's a bully taw, right? Well, most people nowadays are going to be like, huh? What is he talking about, right? So in the footnotes, I explain, well, a white alley is a certain type of shooting marble, right? Bully was slang for like really good back then, and taw was just another slang term for a marble.
Huh.
So just things like that I explain in the footnotes. That.
Would you be a Tolkien fan then if you love language so much?
Yeah, funny you should say that. I'm actually developing a couple of languages because there's a fantasy world I've been working on for a few years building to be used for books and video games.
Cool.
And I've got like a total of about 32 different distinct cultural groups within this fantasy world.
Yeah.
I say cultural groups as opposed to races because there's like I think 5 of them are human, and then another like 4 of them are wood elf or variants of wood elves, and a couple of variants of dwarves. But it's like over 20 races though. Within this fantasy world that I've been creating, calling it Honorheimer. But I've got a couple of full-fledged languages that I'm building from the ground up.
That's great.
Well, I say building from the ground up. Obviously, like Tolkien, I am relying on some real-world languages as kind of like a root. So what I do is I take a real-world language and I just look at some of the root vocabulary, but I'll alter it. So like for one of the languages that I'm building, I'm basing it on Basque, but the grammar is radically different, and while I use the root core parts of the words, I change them up a bit. I change the endings a lot, and to reflect the grammar structure that I'm giving the language and so on.
So that's the kind of storytelling that you would really hope that readers would dig really deep into. It's the kind of thing that you would read and reread and get more and more out of it the deeper you get into it.
Yeah, possibly so. I mean, one reason why I'm developing it as much as I am is Not that you'll necessarily see all of it at all points in the stories. Whenever I create stories set in that world, but if people do become fans of that world and they become hyper fans, you know, they'll have the option of like actually learning the language and being able to converse in it, because the vocabulary will be enough to make that possible.
Well, there you go then. If any of you want to ever flatter Dr. Lore, be sure to speak to him in his own language when you shake his hand someday.
Well, I'm not even fluent in my own in that language yet. It's not done yet. I've got about I've created so far probably between 750 and 800 vocabulary words for it.
Oh, well,
and I've got the grammatical structure worked out for it. But I'm only shooting for about 3,000 to 3,500 words, because that's really all you need as far as core vocabulary, if you have the right grammar structure. In fact, if you go back to Old English, only had about that amount probably,
really?
Because but see, a lot of those ancient languages, and this is something I think a lot of people don't understand, is that okay, English, we have hundreds of thousands of words, but a lot of them are redundant, right? In fact, most of them are redundant, right? But if you go back to like some of the Old English and Proto-Indo-European and so on, the core vocabulary wasn't that big, you know, but they could create other words by putting words together, you know, and they did that a lot.
I see.
All right. And so you didn't necessarily need, if you wanted to say something, you know, for a lot of words, you didn't necessarily need a base word. All you needed was combining two other base words. Something.
So if anyone's curious now, etymology is like sort of doing DNA tests or looking back at the family trees of certain words. And as someone who grew up speaking Greek, I always find it really fun to sort of play with, oh, this word comes from this word in Greek.
And Greek is a big influence on English too. A lot of people don't realize that.
And English, yeah, I mean, English is kind of a late language as far as the older languages go. Latin, a lot of.
Well, not exactly. No,
no,
that's not actually true. English developed, well, compared to other languages spoken today. Now, yeah, obviously Latin's been around a bit longer than English has, but English comes out of the West Germanic dialect of the Proto-Germanic. So if you go all the way back, you got Proto-Indo-European, which then split up into different groups. There was the Eastern group, which went over and became the Indo-Iranic languages, you know, including Persian, Farsi, Dari, which is spoken in Afghanistan, even Hindi in northern India is part of that group, right? And Sanskrit was part of it as well. Then you got the Western group, which basically became all those languages, most of the languages of Europe, I should say, not all, but most languages of Europe are part of that. Greek was one branch of it. Then you have the Italic languages were another one, which Latin was the one that survived. And then you also have the Celtic languages was another group, another branch. And then you had the Proto-Germanic was another branch. And then Proto-Germanic kind of split into the East Germanic, North Germanic, and West Germanic branches. And English was one of the West Germanic ones. And of the West Germanic languages, English is actually the oldest.
Oh, my goodness. So I thought, well, I'm sure maybe later English, but so root-wise, it really was its own language.
Obviously, English has changed a lot. So when I say English, you know, I'm talking about
Old English.
Old English, yes.
So it was its own, really. It became its own language.
Well, yeah, and of course, and you can still, I mean, obviously, languages change so much over time that most linguists say that your average language, 1,000 years is about the most time that goes by before it's unintelligible from before, right? And sometimes it's less than that. Sometimes it's more than that. Like, for instance, Icelandic. People that speak Icelandic today, Icelandic is virtually identical with Old Norse that was spoken 1,000 years ago. So much so that modern speakers of Icelandic can pick up the Old Norse sagas and read them and have no problem following them. That's right. Weird. But you can't really do that with English because English has changed a lot more. Right. So I mean, even going back to the 1300s, right? You get something like Juan that opera with a shoulder so to the rota of marsh that pairs to the rota. You know, you can kind of hear similarities in there somewhere, but you know, the average person hearing that is not going to understand what it means.
Mm-hmm.
On that opera with a shoulder sota, the drota of March hath pierced to the rota. When April with its sweet showers is pierced to the root, the drought of March. Right, you know, and then you go back even further, and the language sounds much more Germanic. You know, like you go back to the old English period, you know, and you got Far ure the orphan havenum sini nami yahalgud. You know, that's English as it was spoken 1,000 years ago. You know,
that's great, man. You have to. People need to know this about you. if they ever need to have a language expert, you're the guy. Then the word needs to be spread about this. If you want it to be.
Well, sure. I mean, now obviously there's probably people out there who are much better at this than I am, but you know, it is kind of one of my passions though, and it's something I enjoy doing. I would now when you say expert, I'm good at research. You know, okay. Researching this stuff. I wouldn't consider myself like fluent in a lot of these ancient languages. You know, like I mean, now I can read Greek and I can read Latin, but I wouldn't consider myself fluent in those languages.
I see.
Right.
But you have a passion for them.
My Latin's probably a little bit better than my Greek, though. I will say that.
Wow. It's very impressive, though. I mean, I've always said for any creative endeavor, passion is really the driving force. If you don't have passion for your project, it's never going to get finished. But if you have a lifelong interest in these sorts of things, I'm so interested in finding out what kinds of work that you want to put out, not just storytelling wise, but what you want to do with these stories.
Right. Well, one of the other, the other graphic novel I was telling you about, the one shot that I might be working on with Matthew Weldon, not sure yet. That one's kind of a sci-fi horror story. So that one's kind of straight up sci-fi. It's a crew on a ship in deep space. They get pulled out of hyperspace and they get woken up from their suspended animation pods, and you know then there's these creatures that are attacking them. You know, very very much almost kind of like I had one person who read it and they said it kind of reminded them of Alien a little bit, except there there's no face huggers. The aliens aren't like that. They're quite different, but in the sense of a crew, you know, and they've got there's an alien menace that's like killing off crew members on a ship, you know, that kind of thing, you know. Obviously the story there's a lot of differences as well. You know?
And that's still in planning.
Yeah, well, it's written. The only thing is it's not illustrated. The whole has to be
converted.
Well, I've actually converted the graphic novel. It's all written out. Okay. The only thing left to do now is to get it illustrated.
Gotcha.
You know, so that's the thing that when you're a writer for comic books, it's the writing part takes a lot less time than the visual art does.
That's an unfortunate truth. Yes.
You know, and so I mean, I've already written a lot of stuff that it's probably going to take a while before it comes out because visual art takes time.
Yeah, and a lot of I guess the Comicsgate people may not know, or comics. I just say indie comics in general. Maybe it's not only time consuming; it's also very expensive because. Let's say it takes a person 6 months to draw a graphic novel or up to a year. Yeah. That's time that's full time. They need to eat. So that's why a lot of these books are so expensive. A lot of the artists and writers, they need to make ends meet somehow.
Yeah.
Isolde Dodling, I'll have this be the last question, then I'll let you go. Where do you start your research? For language, I assume the question's about.
Oh, well, it really depends on the language, really. I mean, now are we talking about creating languages or looking up things in languages that are already there?
Isolde, I think we're talking about how you would research When you said your interest is in researching language, I
Oh,
think
right.
that's when it was asked.
Okay. So, like, if somebody has a question regarding like something in an ancient language,
Yeah, how would you go about looking that up?
well, uh, in some cases, Google. Although you have to be careful, because sometimes you can get bad information that way
Mhm.
too. But uh, with some things, I actually have gone out and bought various things. So like with Greek and Latin, I actually own some Greek and Latin texts and stuff. I've got copies of like Livy and Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars and stuff like that.
Mm.
And so I get in there and I try to read those and to further my understanding. But um,
Yeah,
yeah, no.
so it's
If you're interested in like English specifically,
mm.
uh, there's one guy. I'm trying to think of his name here. Give me a second here. I can find it. Um, there's a guy named Kevin Stroud, right? He's on Twitter at English HistPod. I follow him on there.
Mhm.
But he also has a website called historyoфenglishpodcast.com. All right. And he's really good at digging into English because he takes it all the way back to the Proto-Indo-European. And I listen to his podcast a lot, and I've gone in and done some research on my own outside of that, and to confirm some of the things that he's saying on there, and he's pretty spot on,
Hmm.
from what I've seen.
And do you well, you have your messages open and that sort of thing on Twitter, because I'm sure some people would be fascinated to ask you some more questions about these sorts of things. I want to make sure they can contact you.
Oh, right. Oh,
All right.
well, you can always just tweet to me if you have a question. That's
Right.
fine. And I'll see it if you do that.
Yeah. When it comes to writing and language, especially, just how it ties to storytelling, all of these things are interconnected. I think it's really interesting to look at. Some people have said language is math. Have you ever heard of that one? Mathematics is there's sort of a formula to the language.
To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, especially when you're talking about created languages, though. But the
Mhm.
thing is, natural languages, like real languages, they don't always match up with the rules. Like rules are made to be broken, and languages break them all the time,
All right.
right?
Especially when it comes to informal speech like slang.
Well, exactly. And even when it comes to formal speech, because over time things change, and you look at English, and I mean, English grammar is a big mess, but a lot of that is because of the outside influences on it over time, because you've got the Anglo-Saxons. They came in, they were speaking their language, but a lot of the people that they were taking over from that were living in England before the Anglo-Saxon conquest,
Mhm.
a lot of them were still living there afterward as well. We would people that were now known as the Welsh, but uh, the Anglo-Saxons imposed their language, but they weren't able to make sure that everybody who was now learning the language in the area they just conquered was speaking it correctly,
Mhm.
right? And so a lot of those people, there's a lot of evidence to show that there was a lot of like Welsh influence on changes in the English grammatical structure,
Mhm.
because there's things that happened to English during the Old English period as far as how it was spoken that that are speech patterns that exist in Welsh but not in any of the Germanic languages.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of evidence that there was a Welsh influence. And then of course later on you get the Vikings that came in, and that resulted in a lot of case endings being dropped and so on, and inflections dropping and so on,
Mhm.
because English was a very inflected language back in the day, and now it isn't. Although we still have some remnants of that. By inflection, I mean that a noun would change its form based on what part of speech it was. So, like now we have a dog is a dog, no matter whether it's the object or the subject of the sentence. But
Mhm.
back in Old English, the ending of the word dog would have been different if it was the subject as opposed to whether it was the object and so on.
So, in a sentence, as an example, could I ask for if we're talking about a dog?
Oh, well, I don't remember what the word for it was off
Oh,
the top of my
okay.
head, but I was just using that as an example,
I see. I see.
of how the inflections worked.
Okay.
I don't really speak Old English.
No, no. It's interesting how the language, let's say street language as spoken on as sorry, by commoners on the street. It's almost a sort of rebellious. We're going to make this language our own. Like the latest example I could think of is Cockney slang, where it sounds like gibberish, but amongst themselves, I heard it was invented as a sort of, Alfred Hitchcock talks about this, so that merchants can talk to each other in a sort of code, and they won't, the people buying from them won't know what they're talking about.
Well, that might have been part of it. I've also heard that some of it was so that policemen wouldn't know what they were talking
That
about.
must have been it.
If there was some kind of shady dealings going on and stuff like that, not to say that that was all of it, but I mean, that may have been part of it as well.
There's a sort of, I guess any in-group, you develop your own sort of code and language.
Right. And we still see new words being invented all the time. And another thing that I find fascinating too is how there are words that change meaning over time. And sometimes you get a word that means something very innocuous, but then comes to mean something completely different and maybe even vulgar over time, and vice versa. So, like for instance, in modern English, if we see somebody who's behaving obnoxiously, you might hear someone say, "Oh, that guy's a jerk," But if you went back even 60, 70 years ago, that was considered a very vulgar thing to say. Because the word meant something very vulgar.
Sure.
Right. On the other hand, there was a word that now is considered generally to be a vulgar term for something that once was a term for a male chicken. And I think you know which word I'm talking about.
Sure. Yeah.
But even when it first came to be used for the other thing, it was considered a polite euphemism at first. So when they first started using it, this is back in the early 1800s, when they first started using that term to refer to the other thing,
Right.
it was considered a polite euphemism. But over time, it didn't become polite. It wasn't considered polite anymore. And that's kind of always happens with euphemisms, especially if you invent a euphemism for something, so that you don't have to say something else and sound vulgar or whatever. Over time, the euphemism itself becomes associated, as more and more people start using it for that, then that euphemism becomes vulgar.
I see. So it's really about context and fashion.
A lot of it, yeah.
Is there, this will have to be the last question. I'm so sorry for keeping you on late. I only try to make these about an hour. But what do you think about the controlling of language that we're seeing lately? Is that something that is appropriate to ask about first? I don't want to get too into, not in the political sense, but I notice a lot of attempts at controlling speech these days. And we talk about language. Do you think it's possible to control people's thoughts through the language they are allowed and not allowed to say?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, the thing is, in America especially, we don't really have that, although I see a disturbing trend for that, especially on college campuses now, where we have free speech encoded or enshrined in our Constitution, and yet there's a lot of people that act like we shouldn't, or like they don't want it to be there anymore, and that's kind of a disturbing trend in my opinion. I mean, yes, when you have freedom of speech, people can say some pretty horrible things, but if you take away that freedom, then that's not a good thing either.
It's almost like a pressure valve to be able to say the nasty things. At least you get them out in the open, as opposed to letting them fester. I guess it's not that related, but I think language in itself is just a way of having one mind interface with another. And it's the things that are in people's minds that concern me. The expression is very interesting. It's an art in itself. but as it relates to language, I think there's been a recent, not recent, but I'm sure it crops up in history all the time of people trying to say you're not allowed to say certain things, you must say certain things.
Right.
That's
well, I mean, back in the Victorian period in Britain, I mean, they were so concerned about language that they wouldn't even say the word leg even when they were talking about the leg of a table. They would say the limb of the table
because of its
because the word leg was considered to be somehow
inappropriate.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's where. Okay, I remember hearing about that with the Victorian, the sort of the prudish associations. Okay, so that's real.
Although the Victorians, in other ways, were not quite as prudish as you'd think.
Okay, but
especially,
outwardly,
especially in the early Victorian period. But you know, that's another story.
Well, we have now gotten a huge taste of Dr. Lore, and I hope that you continue to expand on these things on your channel. Let's just give everyone one more plug with everything. You're working on books, and how do we reach you if we want to hear and see more of your work?
Okay, well, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm Dr. Lore on there. Also on Twitter, I'm @LoreDoctor.
Okay. And feel free if you guys have any questions and you want to hear more about this sorts of things. I'm sure he'll be more than interested in expanding on it for you guys. I don't know, just the science of language and how it relates to culture is endlessly fascinating to me. And I'm really pleased that everyone stuck around to listen to all this. I thought this was a really interesting chat. Well, thank you, Doctor, for coming and sharing all this with us. And I really am interested in hearing and seeing the kinds of books that you make in the future. I've got to have you back on. I hope the Comicsgate people also, they want to see and hear more of your books. Are you planning to sort of make a big splash? Like when you guys do the Indiegogo, you're going to get out there, get the word out?
Well, yes, that's definitely the plan. Although I don't know exactly when that's going to be. We'll see. I do know that right now Serena is working on the front cover, and she's also started on the first page of the comic. But she's a working mother, so that takes time.
There you go, guys. And of course, that's Serena Sketches. If you follow Comicsgate at all, you guys, you've all heard of her. It's a small group, but everyone seems to know each other. I think it's a lot of fun. But yeah, all right. So guys and gals, thank you so much for coming and listening. I want to try to do more of these. So if there's anyone who you think would be fun to talk to, please do let me know. I might even do like a call-in style thing where the listeners can come and just chat about whatever. Maybe Sundays, weekends, maybe even weekdays. I don't know. So that's the plan. I don't think I have anything special to plug right now aside from the book is Bad Dreams and Other Stories. If you guys look at my Twitter, the campaign's running for the Indiegogo right now if you guys want to take a look. But yeah, let's do this again.
Oh, and one more thing.
Sure.
If you enjoy short stories, not graphic novel, but if you enjoy some short stories, I do have a collection of short stories that's available on Amazon. It's called Dragon Hill and Other Stories.
Okay, is that in your Twitter too?
I don't know if I have a link to that in my Twitter or not.
Okay, I just want to make sure that there's an archive for all these links.
But if you just type in Dragon Hill and Other Stories in Amazon, you'll find it.
All right, you guys know what to do then. Here's another great creator that we're going to be following. Hopefully we all keep climbing this hill of indie comics. I love indie comics. I love indie fiction in general. There needs to be more of it. So this is a lot of fun. I hope we all get to know each other even better in the years to come. And I'm looking forward to seeing your work.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thanks again, guys, for coming. I'm going to end the broadcast here for tonight. And I'll see you all next time. Thanks for coming.